Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall podcast. We're pumped here at TPM this week. We've if you haven't visited the site or hit political TV in the last couple days, we Monday afternoon we rolled out this series based on this trove of Mark Meadows texts. And probably most of you have seen a lot of this. So I'm not going to go kind of too much into all the nitty gritty right at the head of the show. But our team has just done an amazing job because it's obviously it's a coup to get access. I shouldn't say it's a coup. This is a little too on point for the subject matter. It is a really nice thing to get access as journalists. It's a really nice thing to get access to documents and have some scoops and exclusives. But if you've been watching how this is unfolded over the last couple days, and we're not done with this. This is going to go through the week, and it'll probably move, even beyond this week. As you've seen, we weren't just you know putting together a few kind of juicy quotes and stuff. Our team has really done a great job in putting this stuff in context. What was happening? What was the significance of this communication at the time that it happened? What do the people say about it now? All the basic stuff of really doing something uh, right. So we're really pretty pumped about that, and we're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about the I was going to say the defection of Kyrsten Sinema. I'm not even sure it's a little hard to call it a defection because she didn't become a Republican. She stopped being a Democrat, kind of, sort of, but she's still caucusing with the Democrats. And, functionally speaking, that's what makes you a Democrat as opposed to something else. I noticed that with some of the insider sheets, um, uh, they were sort of generous to her to come up with a different definition of what it means to caucus with a party. Because generally speaking, when you caucus with the party, that means you give them your votes on the critical leadership votes. Doesn't mean you have to vote for with party leadership all the time, but you vote for them to be the leaders, to organize the body, and then you get committee assignments, right? If you think about it, there's no reason there's no constitutional reason why anybody in the House or Senate gets to be on any committee at all. What it is you associate with one party, and there's kind of a global deal. Then you get committee assignments, and depending on your seniority and juice, you get maybe better committee assignments. But anyway, she's doing that. She's caucusing with the Democratic Party in the Senate, just as Angus King and Bernie Sanders caucus with the Democratic Party. So the difference here is, in functional terms, in the Senate, pretty damn minor, almost to the point of being cosmetic. Now, it has a much bigger implication for her reelection campaign because this now means she doesn't have to, difficult primary. What primary? She's not running in the primary, so they can do whatever they want in the primary. But in any case, on this issue of creative definitions, I noticed that I think it was Axios was saying, well, she's not going to go to the caucus meetings, so she's not caucusing with them. Well, that's not what this means. They don't care if she comes to the meetings or not. This is just a kind of the get together once a week to kind of talk shop and everything. It's a bit of a um, it's a bit of a non-team spirit slap, as it were. But and Kate, when I introduce her in a moment, can tell us. But my impression is she already had a reputation of like blowing off those meetings more times than not, as it was. And it's just funny that there is there's this thing about her that one of the things that came up in those reports about her quote unquote defection was, one of these, I think it was Axios again. They're sort of like, peak Washington speak, Washington mind, the sort of the insider conversation. And it said, even though Democrats played a large part in her election in 2018, she's never considered, she's always considered herself her own thing. Well, okay. I mean, contributed? Dude, Democrats made you senator. 100%. 100%. They didn't contribute to it. It's this mentality. And the funny thing is, sometimes people have that kind of mentality, and unfortunately, they have the power to back it up. And then they're just annoying because they're annoying people. But in this case, it's always been kind of uh, the sort of uncanny element to the Sinema story, which is like, you're going to get crushed when you run for reelection because no one likes you. And so, kind of like, you're strutting around, kind of, in this, the world revolves around me, and it kind of does revolve around you as long as there's a 50-50 Senate. But if there's not a 50-50 Senate, or when you have to run for reelection, well, then you got another situation on your hands. I mean, I saw a poll that came out right about, I think maybe even the day she announced this, but obviously the poll was taken before that, so it wasn't taking that into account. And her approval, or her favorability among Arizona Democrats, was at 5%. It's hard to it it is almost impossible to capture how horrendous that is. It's not, normally think about, well, you want approval or favorability around 50%. Among your own party, you need it to be like 90%. Like Mark Kelly, I looked it up. His number going into this cycle was, 91, 92% approval and favorability from Democrats. And in a polarized age, that's what you need, because the other side's going to not like you. So you need all of your team lined up behind you. So we're going to talk about both these things. For some reason, I seem to have more to say about this ridiculous person, Kyrsten Sinema, than our amazing series. But my own weird mental quirks are my problem. Let me remind you before we proceed that the Josh Marshall brought to you by Grady's Cold Brew Ice Coffee. So if you're heading out to grab coffee, stop what you're doing and go for Grady's. Packing quality, flavor, and convenience into a pouch, Grady's Cold Brew Kit makes 36 servings and can be enjoyed for as long as 2 weeks after you brew it. Made with best-in-class ingredients, Grady's gives you the better than coffee house flavor without the long lines or the price. Perfect for home office. Just add water and steep for fresh cold brew on demand from your fridge. Hear that? It's your refrigerators congratulating you for making such a great decision. Ready to give it a swirl? Get 25% off at Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. That's Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. Okay, so Kate Riga, co-host Kate Riga, well, first of all, what's it like having everybody talk about your work?
It's
all o-
weird. It's
all over all over
overwhelming.
all over cable news, and getting, picked up in different publications and everything. It's a nice
Yeah,
feeling.
I mean, I gotta be honest with you. I did not think that our tech series would have such a splash, and not because the quality of the work or anything, but I just thought there is like a point of diminishing returns when people are so accustomed to the fact that these type of people in Trump's orbit are, fundamentally like undemocratic, authoritarian people, um, who wanted to overturn the election and who paid almost no price since then. So I just like really wasn't sure that they would resonate. uh,
Take a second. Take a second.
but happily they did. And I think, you know the one, it's almost funny because I think the person who's probably had the hardest time from these texts being unveiled is Ralph Norman, a Republican congressman from South Carolina, not Ralph Northam, which is every single time I've typed this guy's name, I like quadruple check it because it just hits my ears wrong. But he's the one who called for martial law in the last hours of Trump's presidency, famously at this point spelling it, like Marshall's department store, which kind of has that classic, layer of buffoonishness on top of the authoritarian tendencies.
Yeah, malevolence and poor diction.
Yeah.
Well, it's
Well,
not poor diction actually. It's poor spelling. So uh, malevolence and illiteracy,
yeah,
a
exactly.
potent combination.
And I think his, even the meta story within our story is kind of funny, because it's like we go to him for comment and he's like, that was years ago. Show me the text that you're talking about. And we sent it to him and he did not respond. And then a day later, he responded to a local South Carolina news outlet where he says he corrects his spelling of martial law and says, this came from a source of frustration. Like I was worked up kind of thing. And then yesterday, the White House commented on our reporting, there, and called it a disgusting affront to our principles as a country and everything like that. But I think, it's like two things. I think first of all, it's the fact that so many different members of Congress were involved in these texts. And like as we've said throughout, there's a lot of reason to think that this log that we have is incomplete. There are some texts that seem like they're missing context, or sometimes, and it's Meadows who handed these over, right? So a lot of times there's no response from him, which you can easily kind of imagine how in a lot of these exchanges that paints him in a positive light. If
Yeah, it
someone
makes
comes to
him
him,
like, whoa, that's crazy, man. I'm
exactly,
not even gonna touch that. Yeah.
exactly. But what he did hand over, we've got so much. I mean, we've got dozens of these people, many of whom are still in Congress, many of whom are angling or already secured leadership positions in the Republican caucus. You've got Andy Biggs, who's currently kind of putting himself up for speaker to the Never Kevins. And then you have Perry, who is the chairman of the House Freedom Caucus. So it's not just that these are kind of like irrelevant backbenchers among the hundreds of people who are in the House. I mean, they are important people within the caucus. And it's just, it also, I think, gives us some insight into a question that I think people have been asking a lot ever since January 6th, or really ever since the rise of Trump, which is what percentage of these people is cynical, is seeing this as helpful to their own reelection prospects and to the prospects of the party. So they're kind of willing to hitch their wagon to anything. And what percentage are we being governed by people who are just fully kind of Fox News addled and really, really believe these conspiracy theories? And I think, and we can get into this, different conversations reveal different levels of each, but it's a really intimate portrait, I think, of these people's state of minds and priorities while they were kind of watching this presidential dream crash and burn.
Yeah, I mean, I was just in the midst of writing a post where I haven't published it yet. It'll probably be up by the time you listen to this, where I note, and this is something I said on Chris Hayes' show last night, that, you see these and you're like, wow, this is like a kind of a a bunch of, MAGA trolls on Twitter and down, they're in their back and forth, kind of just like totally crazy stuff. And you're like, wow, these people are in Congress, and that's pretty wild. And so it's not, it's, they're not just dishing this stuff on Fox News to get their people riled up. At some level, they believe it, or at least they stay deep in character. Method acting, right? You got to stay
Right.
in character at all times. Um, at the same time, I do think, there's another thread through all these texts, which is basically like Donald Trump can't lose. That can't happen. And if he's losing, we've got to unlose him, because that's just, we're not living under a Marxist dictatorship. And this is the forces of Christ against the forces of evil and stuff. And when you're talking about it's the forces of Christ and forces of evil, yeah, you're not gonna you're gonna look at the ballots pretty hard, because that's a high standard, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I think it is important to sort of come back to that's really what's going on here. They're not losing is not acceptable to them. Losing is not acceptable, and that is the sort of the kernel of the authoritarian mindset. Uh, and once you make that, once you are in line with that judgment, then come up with whatever. Someone said there was something about Italy and satellites. Well, let's get to the bottom of that, because that's one. It doesn't. And you sort of, in that, it's Ralph Norman's, the martial law guy, right? I
Hmm. Hmm.
getting my people a little confused here sometime. That one is revealing, in the sense that that's, kind of, to most of us, we're already done at that point. We've even already had our insurrection. Like, right, you need election day, you need the vote counting, you need the, that official confirmation they do in mid-September. You need to have your insurrection. And now it's all done, and Joe Biden's about to be sworn in, and he's saying you just got to, like, call out the military and shut down the courts, and Trump's president forever. And kind of
Hmm.
like, okay, I think I get where you're coming from here. Trump losing is just not acceptable.
Right.
Period.
And, Jacob asked us a question about this, which we're, kind of addressing now. Just, to what degree people kind of believe them, and this, quote unquote evidence that just comes across as like nuts to any normal person. And I think the Andy Biggs exchange is a really good illustration of this dynamic that I think shoots through a lot of the conversations, which is, at the beginning, it's Biggs and Meadows. They It's like a totally normal election night conversation. They're being like, I'm, it is all about Arizona. And it's like, I'm seeing good trend lines, the early votes coming in good. This is going well. And then, as we'll remember, Fox News calls Arizona the first night, stirring up just furor on the right. And then a few hours later, you have the AP, but then a few days pass before the rest of the networks catch up. And I still remember we were having kind of internal discussions about being prepared for a recall of that race call, because they were just so out on an island for a while. But as the days elapse and more votes come in, and it becomes clear that even if their call was premature, it was the right one. Um, and it's funny because their conversation goes into like, oh God, like what's our outstanding vote? Where is the rest of it coming from? Which is a totally normal election experience. And then as we get further and further from kind of that crossroads where Trump, some big batch could come in and kind of change his fate, then it immediately kind of, rabbit holes down into Dominion stuff and undocumented immigrants voting in large enough numbers to sway the results. And there's no tenor change. There's no kind of reaction from Meadows of like, what the fuck are you talking about? It kind of smoothly transitions from, well, I
That's a
hope
good
we
point.
get enough from like Pima County or whatever, into maybe the aliens came down and changed the election. And he's like, all right, good thought, good thought. Let's just see where we can get on that.
Yeah, it's the I don't know if we've read the question yet, but I think the person who wrote the question said about how I have often described that these kind of false beliefs, we have a sort of a naive understanding of belief. You often belief is a form of aggression and assertion. And I think that is still in play here to a significant extent. You choose to believe what you want to believe to get you where you need to go. Um, and I think this is still fundamentally about that. But I was, on the other hand, when I've been reading through these various texts, the ones that we have published, and I should just note here, and this is I'm very happy and proud of this. I had very little to do with putting this series together. I did some, I did some final check off, and in any big series, there's legal questions that the person in my position has to kind of, discuss with the editors and blah 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 blah. But this is all the team. This isn't like false modesty. They did this, and what I'm pretty pumped about is, I can take some credit for putting this team together, and so that's incredibly gratifying to see them do this amazing work. So, having said that, the reason I said that then was that I'm not talking about perusing the database. In this case, I'm talking about reading the articles the way that you listeners have read the articles. Um, when you do that, there are a few moments where you half expect, like, is someone going to say, like, it's a bummer we lost? Or kind of like, we're coming up with these, independent legislature theory and Dominion voting and all this kind of stuff. Like, does someone say, like, I wish I wish we had more votes than they did, and that would have meant we won instead of lost, and we wouldn't be having to do this Dominion stuff. And you kind of, you're sort of wondering if someone's gonna kind of go there, like, what about the part where we lost? As you say, they smoothly go from a. I mean, look, people are really into politics. It's really hard to lose an election. People put everything into it. They, it feels very important. It is very important on many levels. So it's tough. And if your election night is looking bad, you're going to be like, all right, are there any counties where there's more votes? And even when all the votes are in, you might be saying, well, how many undervotes were there? How many provisional ballots are out there that might still whatever? That gets a little desperate sometimes, but, like, whatever, right? Everything's got to be looked at and whatever. But there is that thing of, there's no there's no voice of reason or gut check of sort of like, okay, maybe that independent legislature theory is theoretically the case, but what about the part where we lost? Like, is that cool to do that even though we actually lost? Um and that didn't come up.
Yeah. I swear to God, in some of these conversations, especially the ones with people who are a bit more fanatical about Trump, like Norman in one of his texts, goes on about, like, are we gonna let the man who stood up for the unborn, who closed the border, are we gonna abandon him in his moment of need?
And he even said the kind of like, and who supported Israel more than anybody who's
Yes.
ever. That it
Yeah.
was this weird thing, like, sort of like, okay, like, maybe if you're in a campaign speech you might say that, but this is like talking to Mark Meadows, and you're sort of like, kind of like you said, like are, are you going through the campaign, like, dude, like, it's a text with your friend. But yeah, the
Yeah.
kind of like, but that's building up the idea of sort of like, that basic point. It's not okay for us to lose.
Yeah.
And we've got to
Well,
unlose here.
exactly. And it's even more crucial not to lose because this is not about the Republican Party. It's about Trump singularly. So there's no, like, traditionally, when candidates lose hard elections, there is infighting, there is we should have gone to Pennsylvania more, there is he is too old, she is too unlikable. But with Trump, it is not about, well, who can we recruit next time to kind of build on the foundation. It's he is our only salvation, and that is what happens when you build this cult of personality. And that's why I just think it's so silly that now, after the midterms, we keep getting all these pieces about Republicans being ready to jump ship. And it's like, jump ship to what? This isn't about a party or an ideology, both of which Trump is untethered from. It's about this like messianic cult leader that they've chosen. And that's why him losing brings up, I mean, they do anything, right? Because this is like, it's emotional in a way that even very emotional elections in the past aren't, because he's not an executive, he's not a policy guy. I mean, he's a personality and a celebrity. And that is what I think both made him and makes him such a powerful force in our politics, but also just exposes Republicans to the shellacking like they just had.
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes think that in American politics, we dispose of losing candidates a little maybe too quickly,
Mm-hmm.
right? In you go back to Adlai Stevenson in the middle of the 20th century, ran in two consecutive races, although I think he probably got the second bite of the apple because people knew that Eisenhower was really popular and kind of like, whatever, gonna lose, so do whatever you want, dude. But basically, you lose and you're done. Like we never want to hear from you again, right? And before it's a slightly different thing, but before we started recording this morning, we were having a conversation about Jimmy Carter. As he could have, I mean, in theory, he could have run again. He only had one term. He could have run for a second term. Obviously, as certainly anybody of a certain age and even younger people know, for a good decade and a half after Carter left office, not only was there not like a lot of receptivity to him running again, it was almost like we want you to go and like we want you to go to a cabin in Idaho and never come back because we're so ashamed of you. um, but like Michael Dukakis and all, these kind of people, like you had your chance and you're totally done. Don't even think about running for anything ever again. And um that's not always a great thing. I'm always struck by because we've had a number of Republicans have too, but had a number of disappointments over the last few decades, that it's weird when you go from we need Michael Dukakis to be president. He's the guy. This country needs Michael Dukakis to be president. He's got the skills, he's got the experience to kind of like, then the votes don't go right. Like, dude, get the fuck out of here. You weirdo dude from Massachusetts. How the fuck did you ever get the nomination? Go away. Maybe in 20 years, we'll let you come back to the convention as a sort of an elder statesman. And that's kind of premature. And I think part of it is that the presidential nomination process in this country is very entrepreneurial. You kind of just invent yourself, and sometimes you get the nomination. So, like with the caucus, there's no like we've all known Dukakis forever, and finally he's getting the shot kind of thing. No, none of us have ever known of him. He's some dude from Massachusetts. Jimmy Carter, famously the same way, came out of nowhere, up in down in Georgia. So it's much easier to sort of dispose of people politically because we didn't really know them in the first place, right? Um, and to a great extent, since we didn't know them in the first place, they were sort of pitching themselves to us as, I can do it. I can win.
Mhm.
I can do the whole thing. So if you don't win, you're like, you know what? You can't win. Bye. So it's an especially weird thing to go so much in the opposite direction in our politics, where sort of like, this isn't the matter of like, he let down the Republican Party. We let down him.
Mhm.
You know, the country exists for Trump. Trump doesn't exist for the country.
Right.
It's
And
night and
it's
day.
just it's such a constraining it so constrains what the Republican Party can do, because then there's not going to be any discussion of like, how do we broaden our base, how do we appeal to more people, which is funny because it wasn't that long ago, it kind of in the more like Paul Ryan era, where we were getting conversations from Republicans about like, we need to stop hemorrhaging young people, or like, we here's our plan to win back the Latino vote, kind of stuff. Like, that was not that long ago. And now they've just fully kind of hitched their wagon to the idea that Trump has got like, you know 35% of the country like in his pocket, no questions asked. So you got to find a way to kind of ding the Democrat enough, and also often cheat in the system, to find a way to like suppress the Democratic voting pool, so that maybe not even majority, so that plurality is enough to kind of bring you back to success. And I think that's why we keep seeing these preponderance of thought pieces of like, well, this isn't a great strategy, because it's obviously not. By the numbers, it's not. But it also kind of, I think, just explains more the existential crises that these grown men are having, when grown men plus like Marjorie Taylor Greene, but really it is mostly men, are like going through when he loses this election, and then they have to start. In one text, Andy Biggs is like, yeah, the circus is coming to town. And the circus is like Rudy Giuliani and his band of like creepy lawyers to try to explain why you need to overturn just enough votes that Trump can win. And here's our legal strategy for why that makes any sense.
Yeah, there's, again, you go to that, a thing that has been very basic, the through line from the hysterical statements to the much more concrete planning, has been that these state legislatures can just decide the election didn't count and appoint their own electors. And that's just how it is. Now, it is a very shaky legal proposition that that is possible at all. In fact, that was just, in essence, before the Supreme Court just a few days ago. But even if, in some sense, even if that was perhaps true, again, it was just interesting to see in these texts, sort of like, that hasn't happened before. No one's ever thought to do that. And so why exactly are we, like, since we lost, why, you know, why do we get to do this when no one's ever gotten to do this or even thought of doing this, to be quite candid, ever before? And you get some hand waving. Well, there's so many questions, and there's just so much fraud. You can't unwind that, and so
Right.
we have to cancel it and move on. It's a very authoritarian mentality, and one thing that is worth noting here is that not all these people are in the Freedom Caucus, but most of them are. Most of these type of people. And I was noting that Brian Babin guy down in Texas, he's sort of the exception that proves the rule, because he left the Freedom Caucus in 2017 because they weren't being loyal enough to Trump. So that sort of kind of gives you a sense of what that's about. But this group has always been a at least a proto-authoritarian, the F word fascism sort of. it's not a matter of being too nice. It's not. It's a muddy word, and it's not really what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is this sort of Erdogan model in Turkey, the Putin model in Russia. They don't necessarily have paramilitary stormtroopers and stuff. But there's one top cheese, and that guy says how everything's going to work. And that person, directly and indirectly, kind of controls the media, controls the voting. That's where these people are, and they've always been there. And it's worth recognizing and really demanding that others recognize that this is a dangerous group of people, and they always have been, and they have deeply un-American views. Because for most of us, all these shortcomings notwithstanding, civic democracy is that's our jam. That's our thing. We were, early adopters of the civic democracy thing. A very imperfect version, but still, that's our thing, and it's not their thing. And people can have whatever views they want, and if constituencies want to elect people like that to Congress, that is their right. Although there actually is this thing in the Constitution, in the 14th Amendment, that if you uh, make war on the government, if you try to overthrow the government, if you're guilty of sedition, you can be permanently barred from serving in elected office. But we need to be just more frank and direct about who these people are and the danger they represent.
Right, because and fundamentally, as you've mentioned, they're not in a silo. I mean, this isn't just a 4chan messaging board. The Supreme Court heard the argument for the alternate elector scheme, last week, and we discussed it, in depth on last week's pod. But it's not a beyond the pale possibility that some form of that theory is co-signed by our highest body of the judiciary, and it's like we've seen from previous text reporting that Fox News is all in on it, and then you see January 6th, like you see the power that these lies can have over people. So I think sometimes there's this reaction of like, stop talking about Trump, stop talking about Marjorie Taylor Greene. It's just you're amplifying their message and everything like that. And I honestly do understand where that comes from, but ignoring it is not going to make it go away. And I think you can argue that we as journalists do a more important service when we show how even what looks like kind of kooky and ridiculous on its surface can just be very, very motivating to people who already kind of have their lot thrown in with this kind of ideology.
So yeah, this is something that I continue to be very proud of, but also I think is kind of key backstory to this, that we at TPM spent almost a decade really following these people um, before Trump, because Trump was the Freedom Caucus, basically running for president. And when we were doing that, you always had a lot of people saying, come on, this is just a couple weirdos up there who, yeah, they make great copy and they say dumb things, but focus on real politics. Which is what John Boehner's doing, and what Nancy Pelosi's doing, and stuff like this. And our take was always that this actually is the real politics, and that is the sort of the motive force running under everything. They're the one, and what you saw in the kind of Obama second term, even some of his first term, was that the Republican leadership basically led at the sufferance of the Freedom Caucus. They were the one calling the shots, and it was sort of a convenient arrangement for everybody, because the Freedom Caucus got to run the show. But they didn't have to have a lot of scrutiny because hey, John Boehner's the leader, and so that was these people are the real force, and they still are in the Republican Party. That's where the power is, and so you should be focusing on where the power is, and that is, that is where it is, and on on this issue of amplification. Um, I really I I I I think this whole model is so far off. And what that comes down to is, when Trump talks, he's got a whole, or all these different Republicans talk, they have a whole infrastructure to talk to the people they are talking to, who they are trying to motivate, who they are trying to communicate with, who they are trying to activate. When people who are critical of Trump critique his points, deconstruct his points, that's not helping Trump. It may not hurt him a lot. It's not helping him. There's not this whole amplification thing is just wrong. Now there are good and less good ways of of covering that, but it is very easy to slip into this kind of liberal myopia mindset, which, when you really boil it down, is kind of like what we don't look at just kind of ceases to exist. We deprive it of oxygen. I'm like, no, you're putting your head in the sand. You're ignoring what's actually happening. It's not depriving anybody of oxygen. It's just you get the idea, but kind of my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, so let's talk about cinema a bit before we wrap. Like you said in your intro, Josh, she has declared herself an independent. The materials that she kind of released around the announcement were just, oh my gosh, like gut churningly, this like treacly, this is what the American people want. They don't like parties. And me, I'm a maverick, like all that kind of garbage. And like you say, it seems unlikely this is going to have any kind of significant effect on the day-to-day functionings of the Senate because she is continuing to operate as a Democratic senator in all but name. What it really does is makes life difficult for Democrats come 2024 when her seat is up because now they've got no good options, right? Because the way that I think this has kind of been framed is like, well, they either put up a Democrat and risk having the Democrat and Sinema split the kind of non-MAGA vote and then give the Republican a glide path, or they suck it up and they don't run someone else and they get behind Sinema, which has always felt like such a weird presentation to me because why does anyone think Sinema can win, even with the kind of quote unquote might of the Democratic Party behind her? I mean, she's ridiculously unpopular due to the simple fact that everything she's done in the Senate is incoherent and egotistical and self-serving, and that her biggest stands have been on behalf of like the pharmaceutical industry and large companies who don't want to have to pay a minimum corporate tax. She's like really loves to paint herself as this, the John McCain kind of like hero of the ordinary American, without seeming to realize that the biggest headlines she's gotten are when she nixed the corporate tax, and when she was like the one person who said no, the government shouldn't be allowed to negotiate down prescription drug prices. So really what she's doing is making it more likely that Democrats lose the seat in 2024 because whichever of those paths they choose, you've got to hope that if they do put up a real Democrat, a Ruben Gallego or whoever, that
There's also one other congressman who I think is
in the
like
mix.
yeah, it's the congressman from Phoenix. I can't remember. I can't remember his name, but there's at least another now that
Okay.
it's a
Yeah.
little more open, not just Gallego.
But like whoever it is, they're then taking the bet that maybe Sinema will actually leech votes from the old-fashioned kind of Republicans, based on what candidate Republicans run. And I mean, that is the way that kind of Republicans could shoot themselves in the foot and salvage Democrats' chances, which after this cycle is not, a foregone conclusion. Like they could nominate another Blake Masters type psychopath who changes the dynamic a bit. I think the real concern for Democrats at this point is if Republicans put up someone normal and then you've got Sinema acting as spoiler for the Democrat.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a complicated thing because uh, Democrats, on paper, you can say, okay, Democrats have won, 3 straight Senate elections in Arizona. You can't sneeze at that. You can't say it's a Republican lock if they've won successive elections like that. Obviously, each of those elections was in somewhat unique circumstances. One was in the 2018, wave, although it wasn't much of a wave in the Senate. One was there. Then you had COVID election. Then you had whatever happened in 2022. So it's always going to be any Democratic win in Arizona is going to be a couple percentage point play. And although I guess the other, well, it's libertarian, different thing. It's going to be very close. So if you have a second Democrat, or at least someone taking from the Democratic pile of votes, and if they're only picking up 5%, that can be more than enough to give it to the Republican. More than enough. So it doesn't, she doesn't have to do great. She can do terribly and still be an effective spoiler. What I am not convinced of, frankly, is does she really want to run for reelection and get like 6% of the vote? That's so humiliating. It's hard for me to imagine that that actually happens. And she is so unpopular among Democrats that it sounds like I'm kind of trash talking to say she'd get 6%. But again, she is very unpopular among Democrats. If this scenario happens, she won't be the Democrat. She'll get a lot of antipathy from Democrats as a spoiler. So I think that's entirely possible. And I just don't see why she would do that. So I think that there's, she's trying to basically play a game of chicken with them. You've got to line up behind me. But to your point, Kate, what you were saying just a moment ago, I don't think it would matter if the party leadership did line up behind her. And I think it might be kind of tempting for them, as upsetting as that might be to hear, just because she's the incumbent senator. You don't want to lose any. You can't afford it's such a hard map in 2024. You can't afford to lose anyone. But even if they did want to do that, the votes are just not going to be there. Democrats really, really despise her now in Arizona. Now, I'm not saying every last one, but I mean, if half of Democrats despise her, which I don't think there's any question of, you're toast. There's no way you're going to win. So I don't know. The fact that I think she will drop down to like single digits, I think she may not run. And someone else mentioned something to me. I didn't verify this directly, so put an asterisk over what I'm about to say. But what I heard, and this is the case in many states, if you're running as one of the two major party candidates, you need maybe 7 or 8,000 signatures to get on the ballot. If you're running it as an independent candidate, you need like 40,000 signatures to get on the ballot. That's a challenge. That's a lot of signatures. And if you're already not unpopular, it's a real challenge. Now, I'm not saying she absolutely could not get 40,000 signatures, but that ends up being a major expense and a major thing. There's also the fact that where's she going to get the money from? I guarantee you, Act Blue is not going to get it done for her. And suddenly, all her Republican friends are going to be a little less excited because she's running against a Republican. Now, you probably get some dark money groups, kind of coming in to help her out a bit. But those groups tend to be very mercenary, very transactional. They're not trying to make a point of principle for someone who's getting like 5%. So I one of the continuing oddities of this whole Kyrsten Sinema drama is that she has for a long time not seemed to have a sense of how bad a position that she is in, how few cards she has to play. Now, maybe she knows something we don't. Maybe. I really doubt it, to be honest with you. But we'll see. I would say this. I'm highly confident she will not be a senator in 2025. It's quite possible she'll be replaced by a Republican, but it is, to me at least, very, very hard to find a scenario where she wins re-election. The irony is, let's say the leadership really does try to like just jam this down Arizona's collective throat, right? You have to
Mhm.
take her. I don't think they're going to do that. Don't interpret this as like, oh, Josh has heard they want to do that. I don't think that's. But I'm saying if they did, you would almost certainly get a Green Party type candidate who would siphon off votes. And the irony, of course, is that Sinema was a Green Party candidate. That's her origin story. Um, so I just don't think it can happen. And she can make a lot of ads about independent, yada, maverick, and stuff. But Democrats don't like her. They're really pissed at her. And I just don't think she has any way she's going to win. And because of that, I think at the end of the day, she will not run.
The Green Party giveth, the Green Party taketh away. And the other
Exactly.
piece of this is like for any listeners who are feeling like, well, it's 2 years away, maybe she can kind of rehab her image in that time. I just think the political realities of Congress are not going to allow for that because
Correct.
our time of productive legislating in Joe Biden's first term is over. I mean, the rest of the 2 years is going to be judicial nominations and really scary fights over the bills that have to get passed, the funding stuff. And, that's where the debt ceiling comes in and all of that. And, you know, even if they manage to pass a few more stuff in the lame duck, which is not, completely off the table, it's not going to be something like abortion protections, something that would really kind of rattle the foundations. She has set in stone what her legacy is going to be by supporting the filibuster and stymieing all the legislation that could have come through. And she seems to think that her leadership on like the modest gun reform bill or, the same sex marriage bill will be enough to erase from Democrats' brains all that she has blocked and oftentimes blocked with panache, like when she voted down the minimum wage thing with a curtsy. So she can kind of toe her former party line all she wants the next 2 years and rubber stamp every judge that comes across the Senate. And absolutely nobody is going to pay attention or know about it because that's a kind of a normal behavior for Democratic senators. That doesn't make you a special gold star senator to be Biden's ally in filling the judiciary. So I just don't think she's going to have any opportunity to kind of like recalibrate what she's already done. I mean, even if, say, next term she says, you know what, I've thought about it. I am now against the filibuster. so what? I mean, nothing's gonna
Yeah, so
pass
what?
from the House,
Yeah,
so you kind of
yeah,
miss the opportunity.
exactly. And I think that the other part of that is that by ceasing to be a Democrat, and I think when she did that, she actually made an announcement like, the Democratic Party of Arizona is just as extreme as the
Mhm.
Republicans, more political extremism. That's not that's not recalibrating, and so that kind of lays down a marker of what I mean. She has left the Democratic Party, so basically now she has to lean into, I'm not a Democrat, I'm in the middle, I'm apart from both extremes. So she's really walled off for herself the opportunity to recover any ground on that front. And the irony there is, and I think we may have discussed this in an earlier pod, had the Democrats held the House, there actually was a path for her. And the path
Mhm.
would be this: you pass the Roe law in the House, um, even though, uh, we needed to get 52 senators, but that's premised on Manchin and Sinema staying loyal to the filibuster. So they pass it in the House, and now Sinema says, you know what? For this, we have to set aside the filibuster, and we are going to make Roe the law of the land, blah, 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 blah. I think if she did that for all the crap in the previous 2 years, if she did that, that is such an important thing for so many Democrats, for so many women, for so many people. And if she played it the right way, you know, this is so important to me. It's so core. Filibuster can't stand in the way. Tons of people would be like, wow, she sucked, but man, she came through. She made the right decision. And if she just kind of, not, not to trivialize it, but, went on a little kind of Planned Parenthood tour around the country, right? Kind of talking that up. That's the kind of thing that I think could solve her problem going into 2024. Because a lot of the things we're talking about this bill and that bill and whatever got cut out of, cut from the first BBB to the second BBB, and the fact that everybody was so upset about the filibuster. Most people don't follow all those ins and outs, but a lot of people are paying attention that in half the country now, you can't get a legal abortion. And it's not technically 100% illegal, maybe half, but you get the idea, all that kind of stuff. But once they lost the House, that path closed. So the one thing that, now, whether she would have done that is a whole other question, but she
Right.
could have done that and she didn't. And now there, as you say, there's no building blocks for her to, um, make up ground. And I think it's the kind of thing, it would have to be something so huge, because you can't say like, oh, this regulatory thing that you've never heard of, I'm going to support it now. Like, what? No, I mean, I'm
Right.
not. Those things can be very important, but it's nothing that any kind of mass political audience has any idea what you're talking about.
And
So,
ironically, that would be moment on abortion, that would have been her John McCain moment, right? That would have been his thumbs down to repealing Obamacare, which endeared him to, you know, so many Democrats who had spent most of their lives in opposition to him. Now, of course, that was also kind of helped by the fact that his party was going completely off the rails at the time, but still, that would have been her maverick moment, but no longer.
yeah, it is just closed.
Yep.
There's no question about it.
All right. So we took Jacob's question earlier about what these people actually believe in our text story. So let's finish up with this one from Carl, who says, with 51 seats, can the Democrats in the Senate launch an investigation of Mark Meadows' texts surrounding the January 6th attack on Congress, and should they?
Well, I would say there's two things. The House January 6th committee has had those texts for months, maybe
Mm-hmm.
even as long as a year. I lose track at this point. They have a report coming out, I think, in about 10 days. They're going to make criminal referrals. They're going to do blah, 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 blah. So I think there's a good argument that those texts, the public may not have known about them. You do now, thanks to the good people at TPM, but the investigators have known about them. So I don't know what more there necessarily is to do on those texts from Mark Meadows. Having said that, there has been some talk, and to your 51 question, yeah, they can do whatever they want. They have 51 votes, so they can do subpoenas and they run things there now. So yes, they can. There's been some talk of the House people should just, kind of put the whole thing on a zip drive and hand it off to the folks in the Senate, and they'll continue carrying the ball. I don't. It's impossible for me to know from the outside. Is there more? Is there more to investigate? Um, there's always new things you can find out, but that doesn't mean there's a need for more congressional investigations. Um, so I don't know, but I do think they should use the opportunity of controlling the Senate to keep it going if there's more that needs to be done. And probably the House people would be the ones most in a position to speak to that. I would say too, though, in the broader discussion of the preservation of civic democracy in this country, uh, right wing paramilitary organizations, white supremacist organizations, there's more to be done than just what happened on January 6th and the lead up to that. And, you just smart people have to make a judgment about where to put the most energy. But there's a lot to get to the bottom of. And I certainly hope on the Senate side that they will.
Yeah, um, that's kind of where I am too. And it's hard to also kind of answer this definitively until we see the report, because
Yeah.
it's just hard to know how aggressive it's going to be. Especially because the January 6th committee has, I don't want to say out of sight, out of mind, but been out of kind of the public sphere for a while now. They had their big blockbuster hearings largely over the summer. And now we assume they're just kind of back to the work of investigating and pulling together this report. Um, so I guess I can see a world where if this report comes out and is somehow weaker than we'd expect from what we saw publicly, that the Senate would want to kind of do more work there. But what we've seen is kind of an uncompromising, aggressive, willing to name names and point fingers kind of operation. So I don't really think that's what's in store. But I totally, totally agree with you that the groundswell of, you know, particularly radicalized young men um, being swayed by these forces of authoritarianism and misogyny and anti-Semitism and racism, especially to perpetuate acts of violence, is directly connected to the January 6th committee, but a much larger contagion that we have not really fully kind of reckoned with or
Mm-hmm.
tracked. And I
Mm-hmm.
think
Mm-hmm.
having a nexus for that kind of stuff in a Senate committee could be, fertile ground and helpful to kind of contextualizing these lone wolf attacks into a bigger picture.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think a separate point that is really worth keeping in mind, that I don't know exactly how long this committee has operated. I think it's upwards of 18 months, maybe not
Mm,
quite 18 months, but upwards of 18 months, something like that. It got started maybe late spring of 2021. Um, that is enough time to do a lot of stuff. Now, I don't know. Often the different targets of the investigation were going through various legal angles to kind of wait them out, and sometimes you haven't gotten the big stuff. But as a general matter, I think we should, um, having accountability, having justice is really not measured in the length of time that an investigation goes on. Sometimes that doesn't mean you're going to get what you want, because accountability is not just through investigation. But in any case, my point is the Jan 6 investigation does not necessarily need to go on for 5 years, right? We'll see what they got done. And yeah, I think that's it. And I think we both agree that there's plenty to investigate, and the Senate Democrats should have an ambitious plan for investigations in this general area. But they should look at what the House did, and if they basically kind of, ran it to ground, there's no need just to kind of keep this thing going for no particular reason.
Right.
That's
It's not
my take, at least.
Benghazi or something crazy like
Well,
that.
and that's kind of the thing, is that obviously Benghazi was inherently different, since the whole thing was sort of absurd. But it's worth keeping in mind. At a certain point, you're just, it doesn't take 6 years to investigate something. They got a lot of money. They got a lot of investigators. This isn't like, Lynn Cheney needed to kind of read through all the documents herself. So I tend to think they've probably done a pretty good job of running this to ground. But we'll see. We'll see what comes out when they release the report. And I believe they're, what is it, tentatively scheduled? It's supposed to be the 21st. So that's only
Merry
like a
Christmas
week away.
to all.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Merry Christmas more for some than for others. But yeah. Okay.
All right.
I guess that's all the quality content we are going to produce for this episode. A full hour and 9 minutes worth, if I'm counting correctly. Well, remember, the Josh Marshall podcast is brought to you by Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee. You can get 25% off using the promo code TPM when you make a purchase, any and all purchases, not just one time going forward. Grady'sColdBrew.com. And let me say one thing before we sign off. Thank you so much for supporting this organization. You don't have to be a member to listen to the podcast, so not all of you are members, but I think probably the majority of you are. And I corresponded with a number of you by email over the last couple of days, and every time I wanted to say thank you. It is the subscription fees that makes the whole organization possible. It's almost 90% of our revenue comes from your subscriptions. So that is huge, that there's no TPM without that. So I hope when you see these articles coming out, if you're a member, you can say kind of like, I made that possible, because you really did. So we truly appreciate it. Thank you so much. If you're listening and you're not a member, you too could have all these positive feelings if you want to sign up. But seriously, thank you to our members. This wouldn't be possible without you, and I want you to know that we really, really appreciate it.
Totally. Thanks so much.
All right. We'll talk to you next week.
See you next week.
Later.
The Josh Marshall podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.